12 o'clock, so we're going to get started here. Today we have a really interesting lecture from Dr. Tracy Yuping Wong, the Chief Officer of Comparative Clinical Effectiveness Research at the Patient-Centered Outcomes Research Institute in DC. The title of lecture is Engaging Patients and Communities in CER to Improve Healthcare Outcomes. Next week, we do have a lecture by our own Dr. Henry Silverman, AI Tools in Research, Navigating Ethical Risk and Research Integrity. Dr. Kierbeck, you can go ahead and do your introduction.
Thank you so much. What a pleasure today to introduce our speaker. It's such a treat. Dr. Wang is a chief of comparative clinical effectiveness research at PCORI and a cardiologist whose work has shaped the fields of observational research, implementation science, and pragmatic clinical trials. In her current role, she leads PCORI's national portfolio in comparative clinical effectiveness research, advancing patient-centered evidence to improve healthcare delivery and outcomes through multidisciplinary collaboration. Prior to joining PCORI, Dr. Wang was a professor of medicine at Duke University and a senior investigator at the Duke Clinical Research Institute, where she led large-scale studies focused on comparative effectiveness, medication safety, and quality improvement. She has authored more than 350 peer-reviewed publications and is widely recognized for her work in pragmatic trials and the use of real-world data to address gaps in care and disparities in outcome. Dr. Wang has held numerous national leadership roles, including service with the American Heart Association, where she chaired the Quality of Care and Outcomes Research Council. Her contributions have been recognized with multiple awards, including the AHA QCOR Outstanding Lifetime Achievement Award. She currently serves as an associate editor for JAMA Internal Medicine and sits on several editorial board for high-impact journals. A graduate of Yale University, Dr. Wang received her medical degree from Harvard Medical School, Master of Science degree in molecular biochemistry and biophysics from Yale University, and Master of Health Science degree in clinical research from Duke University. Dr. Wang, we are thrilled to have you with us today, and we welcome you.
Thank you so much, Dr. Kierbeck. I'm going to start sharing my slides. It's a pleasure to be here today. Let's see if I can get the technology to work correctly. Do you hopefully see a title slide for the talk?
Yes, we do.
And it's not in some funky presentation mode that you're not supposed to be seeing.
It is. Appears appropriate.
Thank you very much. Okay, so my talk today is going to be about engaging patients and communities in comparative clinical effectiveness research to improve healthcare and outcomes. It's a bit of a mouthful, so bear with me. Looking ahead, though, I have to say that AI talk next week looks really good. So I might have to see if I can come join you there. I am myself starting a course in AI. So interested in a lot of these, learning a little bit about that. As Dr. Kierbeck mentioned, I am a cardiologist by training, and I actually still practice cardiology, but I'm not going to try to let that influence my comments and bias my comments too much. Today, I'm going to talk a little bit about PCORI, the Patient-Centered Outcomes Research Institute, and what we fund here. I think we're kind of in an environment where funding is quite precious. It's hard to get. And people often ask the question, what exactly does PCORI fund? And it's actually not too difficult of a question because unlike massive funding agencies like the NIH, PCORI actually only funds one branch of science, and that's patient-centered comparative clinical effectiveness research. What does that mean? Well, if you think back to when PCORI was established about 15 years ago by Congress, the thought at that point was that people were facing decisions every day in their healthcare and the kind of health choices that they had. And the motivation was for PCORI to fund research that provides the kind of comparative effectiveness evidence that helps people make those kinds of decisions. And so everything we fund involves comparing two or more different things, whether these are treatments, whether these are diagnostic procedures, screening procedures, or any kind of health service or health practice, and preferably done in a real world population setting. So not necessarily in a clean laboratory controlled type of environment. On the right, you see a graphic that I worked with AI to try to produce. It's my first AI cartoon that I've ever done. Hope it's not too geeky, but it's, if you wanted to sort of think a little bit about what PCORI funds, here's one framework. Pretend you're the patient that's sitting in this office, or you're the physician that's sitting in this office, and you're offering two types of choices to the patient, blue pill, red pill in this case. And you're doing this in the context of a lot of information out there. For example, on TV, that's already advertising one versus the other, but you're still not sure which one works best for the patient in front of you, or which one your patient in front of you would prefer to be taking. That's the type of question that PCORI funds. Now, this is a patient-clinician duo. You could also think about this from a health system standpoint. As a health system, we can choose to go this route versus that route in terms of providing care. Which is one that patients prefer? Which is one that provides more effective care? Which is the one that improves health outcomes the most? That's the kind of comparison we're talking about when we're saying comparative clinical effectiveness research. And I'm going to get to the patient-centered in a little bit. So if you're thinking about CER funding opportunities, the most up-to-date way to find those opportunities is to follow that QR code on the right to our funding opportunities page, because it gives you the most up-to-date funding opportunities there are for PCORI. Broadly speaking, from a CER standpoint, there are three large categories of funding opportunities we usually do. Broad pragmatic studies, the first category, is our bread and butter type of funding opportunity. That can range from a direct cost of $0 million to $12 million. So it could be large, medium, or small sized projects. And this could be in any clinical area. So whatever specialty you're in, whatever topic area within that specialty, as long as you and the patient community feel that this is an important area that has an evidence gap, has a CER-worthy question, bring those questions into the broad pragmatic studies funding opportunity. This is one where you could be a prospective study, a retrospective study. It could be a large clinical trial. It could be a large randomized trial. It could be a small observational study. We don't typically fund single center studies, so that kind of dictates how small it has to be. There has to be some sort of generalizable insight from this. But the BPS mechanism is probably the one that most folks have exposure to. The second category of funding opportunities is the placer funding opportunity. And this is designed for high risk, high reward types of studies. So you can see the direct cost cap goes up to $22 million. These are generally large, high risk, high reward, meritorious, always randomized clinical trials. And they require some risk. So that's why these are called phased research awards. Generally, you have 18 months after you get the award to show that you can actually get that population enrolled into your study and everything is feasible before you're able to tap into the rest of your budget to finish the trial. So these are for those of you who are interested in some of those questions that really can't be answered in any way rigorously without an RCT. and require a hefty investment to be able to get to the answer for. And then finally, there are a cluster of funding opportunities that we call topical or topic-focused funding opportunities. And this is where PCORI, we're always talking to the community. And the community sometimes is telling us, hey, we are desperately in need of evidence in these particular areas. And so we put out a call for research in those particular areas. Sometimes they come in individual funding opportunities. Sometimes they're embedded as part of the broad pragmatic studies you see on the left in terms of areas of emphasis. The dollar amount cap for these varies depending on what the needs are. But those are more focused funding opportunities where it's really a patient community or a payer community or some sort of stakeholder community saying to PCORI, look, we are in urgent need of evidence here. So you can keep your eyes peeled for that, but just because we don't call for it doesn't mean that you can't bring that in anyway through either of the first two mechanisms. So those are sort of our funding opportunities. And for that latter, in terms of focused funding opportunities, these are the current 11 themes that communities have reflected that there is a need. They're very, very broad. And so we continue to engage with the community to fine tune exactly what areas are needed under this rubric. And you'll see these popping up in funding opportunities over the next year to 3 years for these particular areas here. Okay, so I promised I'd talk a little bit about patient-centered CER. What does that mean? Every single PCORI-funded CER award has to meet every single one of these foundational expectations for partnership and research. Basically, what we're looking for, and I've seen some really good research ideas not get funded because they didn't meet one or more of these criteria. Because we are the Patient-Centered Outcomes Research Institute, we want patients, caregivers, other community stakeholders to be part and parcel of the research, not just as participants, but as people who help you, who partner with you as researchers in getting the work started, completed, and disseminated at the end of the day. And so you're working together as a team. You're engaging these folks, not when things are going wrong, but from the very beginning of the project all the way through the end of the project. Now, this isn't easy to do, but we've had 15 years of funding projects and that do this, and there's a lot of experience and a lot of new knowledge and tools. And if you, again, follow that QR code on the right or that link at the bottom, you will see more details on how to meet these criteria. Because if you do not meet any one of these criteria, you will not be funded, even if it is the best research idea since sliced cheese. So, so do pay attention to this. I can't highlight this enough. Here's another slide that kind of summarizes what we mean. So back when I was writing research proposals, this was about 4 years ago before I joined PCORI, I was an academic cardiologist at Duke, trying to get funding as well. I would assemble focus groups with patients, and I would say to them, hey, here's my idea for the type of research that I'd like to do. What do you think about my idea? Well, now in retrospect, that is really what's shown on the very left-hand side of the slide, where it's one-sided input through focus group, town halls, crowdsourcing type of information that brings patients into the research. But almost everything we fund at PCORI, that input is not enough. The closer you get to the right-hand side of the slide, the more patient-centered you are and the more likely you are to get prioritized for funding. So you will see that there are study teams that have a consultative model. They have a patient community advisory committee sitting on the side where there's a more two-way consultation into what's going on in the study, how to get the study going. Then you see the next step up is a collaborative model where some of the patient investigators are taking on responsibility and accountability as collaborating partners in the project. And on the very right-hand side is shared leadership. And some of our funding opportunities actually absolutely require this. The funding gets split into two buckets. One bucket goes to the research organization and one bucket goes to a community organization so that there's dual PI, shared leadership, shared accountability with designated scopes in each of these scopes of performance in each of these areas. So as I said, if you go closer to the right-hand side of the slide in your application describing what you're planning to do, what you already are building that on in terms of current experience, the higher the likelihood that you might be able to get prioritized for funding. And like I said, we've had about 15 years of doing this, and it's yielded good stuff for us. So, for example, if you look at all of the PCORI awards compared with the benchmark of all other clinical trials, you're going to see that in our research, our funded research, a higher percentage of the research results are being returned to the patient community, in particular to the folks that participated in the study. So on the right, you see an example. I'll talk a little bit more about this example where it was a study about appendicitis, comparing immediate surgery versus antibiotics. And after the trial was complete, the investigators put together a very nice summary in multiple languages that was disseminated to their participants as well as more broadly to be able to make sure that these results are out there quicker, that they're out there to the people that matter, and hopefully get implemented into practice a lot quicker than a lot of other clinical trials are. So I'm going to spend a lot of time on this slide because people often ask me, what do I need to pay attention in my research plan? And so I'll take this from using sort of the PCOTS framework. From a population standpoint, we generally want the study population. We want you to make the case that the study population involves patients that have a need. Okay, so they have a health condition that's highly prevalent or highly incident. There's a huge burden of disease. There's notable variations in care, or there are populations that have really not been studied in previous studies before. So you need to make the case for why you're looking at these populations. From an intervention or comparator standpoint, this one I'm going to spend a little bit of time on. Now, remember, go back to that first graphic that I showed on the very first slide. We are about funding evidence that informs decisions, clinical choices, health choices. In routine practice, these choices have to be present, meaning it's already something that you as a clinician can use already as part of your clinical practice. And so that's generally something that has established efficacy already. It's out there, but there's concerns about which approach is better or which choice is better. I'm happy to share my slides after the talk. So these are things that are have established efficacy, but lacking in effectiveness information. Or if there's no evidence of established efficacy, then you've got to provide some sort of evidence that there is national evidence of widespread use. So even though these two things that you're comparing between don't have a lot of data behind them, you're seeing that in routine practice, clinicians, patients, payers, health systems are already forced to choose between these two or three or whatever, however many different comparators. So these are commonly being chosen between. Okay. So if your comparator can't fit either established efficacy or widespread use, then it's generally not going to be fundable by PCORI. Another way of saying this is if you're actually looking at an intervention that's really never been tested before, it's not really used widely, then it's probably not responsive. So, for example, yesterday I had a conversation with this individual who's talking about a community program that they have locally that helps people with substance use disease get into stable housing. And it's a wonderful concept. However, it is all that program that they're hoping to find the effectiveness for is really only available in that particular city. It's not available in that particular health system. It's not available anywhere else. And there is no established evidence of efficacy of that program. And so I had to say to her, this sounds like a very good question and a very needy population, but you're not meeting the criteria of established efficacy or widespread use, which is a criteria you need to meet in order to be eligible for PCORI funding. So that was a little disappointing, I'm sure, on her end. But I wanted to sort of give you that as an example of, why sometimes there might be a perfectly good question, but it's just not the type of question PCORI is able to fund for you. Outcomes. The outcomes need to be patient-centered, and they generally are health-related outcomes, although we also, since 2019, our reauthorization, have welcomed secondary outcomes that are related to patient-centered economic and other health-related burdens, such as time away from work, to be able to meet healthcare appointments and things like that. So these outcomes have to be patient-centered, which is where that patient engagement is important because they are part of your team's response to your investigator team's response to why these are patient-centered outcomes. If you're going to use an instrument to measure certain health outcomes, those instruments need to be validated instruments. I already told you real-world settings, healthcare practices. By the time you have an application that is coming to us, it is also good for you to Google the PCORI methodology standards because we need your research to be methodologically rigorous. And at that point, you probably should be checking the methodology standards so that whatever your study design is, you're meeting the criteria for methodologic standards for those for that type of research. I mentioned we prioritize research that are generalizable, which is why we generally don't fund single hospital, single center types of studies. We would like the results to be implementable as soon as the research are done. So it's always good to make sure that you've got some sense of how to get these research results into practice fairly quickly after your research is completed. And especially if you're asking for a budget that's over $5 million, you should probably be powering for some sort of heterogeneity of treatment effectiveness study aims. So a good chunk of our studies, actually for the main research question, have a statistical power of 90+%, in part because they are trying to make sure that they will still have at least 80% power for some of the subgroups that they are looking at, specifically relevant to that research question. So I went over this slide in detail, but if you're a researcher, hopefully this is helpful to you in terms of thinking about how to strengthen your application to make sure that it is responsive to PCORI's research application requirements. Now, more often than not, I get the question, what do you not fund? Well, we don't fund any discovery science. So anything that's unproven, something that you're trying to explore the efficacy of, for example, we're not going to be able to fund this. We don't fund first-in-man studies. We don't fund early phase studies. Almost everything we fund, if you think about sort of clinical trial phases, is late phase 3, phase 4, or onwards. We do not fund the development, testing, or validation of new instruments, surveys, prognostic tools. We all fund how you apply them, but we don't fund the development or validation of them. everything we fund is powered adequately for the primary study endpoint. We do not fund vanguard studies or pilot studies intended to inform larger efforts. Our placer studies, the ones that I mentioned at the very beginning, those $22 million studies, they generally are fully powered studies, but they just come in two phases, a feasibility phase to make sure that you can get to the later phase. But we fund that as one package, not as, you will only fund the first phase. It's important to distinguish between quality improvement and research. We don't fund quality improvement, we fund research. We do not fund epidemiology studies, natural history studies. We do not fund PK/PD studies. We do have some studies that have biomarker endpoints or outcomes. For example, we have studies that are looking at A1C as a measure of glycemic control in a diabetic population, for example. And the onus is on the applicant to make sure that whatever endpoint that you're measuring is patient-centered. Patients feel that this is important, so that it's not just a surrogate outcome to get to a easier power calculation. So those kinds of biologic endpoints we do fund. However, we don't fund biologic endpoints like biomarker endpoints, for example, that are only used in a research setting and don't drive clinical decision making. So for example, we had this lovely study proposed that looked at a chronic kidney population and was looking at many of the markers that are kind of exploratory for when to start dialysis, that are really not being used in clinical in sort of routine clinical practice to determine the need for dialysis onset. So those kinds of things are considered a little too early stage, a little too biologic mechanism oriented to qualify for PCORI funding. And then if you were around when we were authorized, you know that there was a lot of discussion about what PCORI can and can't fund. And one of the classic things that came out of that is PCORI does not fund any sort of comparative policy types of questions or any sort of cost effectiveness analysis of any sort. Now, you're welcome to do natural experiments that show that for example, because of a health policy, one group of patients were more likely to be exposed to a certain health intervention versus another, or a certain screening test versus the other. That is fine. That's grounded clinically in terms of the question being, does the health intervention improve health? But a question that simply asks, did this state's health policy compared to this state's health policy produce better outcomes, is probably off limits for PCORI. Okay. And don't worry, I left a good chunk of time at the end for questions from the audience, so you're always welcome to ask questions. Now, I talked about patient-centeredness because this is something that is really important to us. And we mean it by how we constitute our peer review panel. So when an application comes in, they undergo peer review. And in our PCORI lingo, we call it merit review. I will tell you that scientists make up a good chunk, but not the entirety of our merit review panels. We have at least a third, if not more, of these panels made up by patients with no clinical background, caregivers of patients like parents, health aides, etc., and healthcare community stakeholders, so policymakers, payers, clinicians who are not academically oriented at all, doulas, community health workers, industry decision makers. So these constitute a very diverse panel of reviewers that review every single application. And so if you look at the top right-hand side of the slide, you'll see a list of criteria. You'll see that it goes beyond some of the sort of innovation, significance, environment types of questions that guide a lot of grant mechanisms to other things such as patient-centeredness, the potential for immediate adoption into clinical practice, how much patient community engagement and partnership there is in the research question. So I want you to make sure that you're not just addressing the first few things, which are more about scientific merit, but also addressing some of the latter criteria that are very important and probably unique to PCORI, because more than a third of the folks reading your application is not going to be that jazzed or that geeky about your science as I might be. These days, every funding agency is seeing double, sometimes tripling of their funding of their applications coming in. We do things a little differently. We start out with a shorter letter of intent. Generally, it's about 3 pages worth of text describing what you're planning to submit. And we will generally give you a yes, no after the letter of intent. And only those who got a yes will be invited to apply for the full application. This is done for both the public's benefit as well as ours. We don't want to waste your time. We don't want to waste our time. If something's probably not going to be high enough priority for PCORI to fund, we're going to probably tell you that at the letter of intent stage rather than having you put together a several hundred-page application and then getting rejected then. It's not fun to hear as an investigator. I certainly didn't like it when I was an investigator getting an LOI rejected, but after I'm done with the application, generally I feel like I've lost about a year of my life doing that application. So I would like to make sure that that application actually means something. So it's a glass half full, half empty type of feeling there. I'm going to give you a few examples of the type of research that we're funded. I'm going to cover a lot of different clinical areas because I think we've got a pretty varied audience here. And some of this, you're going to see different formats of how I present this because I want you to kind of get a sense for what a lay reviewer is going to think about versus what a scientific reviewer is going to think about. So take this one. This is one that is a study of children, school-age children, who are more likely to have teeth decay. And they actually targeted a population of 48 schools. 80% of these schools were receiving free or reduced cost lunches. So you can see the social determinants of health angle to this. Now, the two comparators that we're looking at, and I'm not a dentist person by any means, so if I'm saying something wrong, please forgive me. But they were comparing two different things. The more traditional treatment, I think, was the atraumatic restorative treatment, where someone's taking a pick and trying to pick the stuff out, the decayed stuff out. As you can imagine, that can only be done by someone with dental training. The other comparator was silver diamine fluoride, where someone's actually going on and pasting something on the teeth. It's a topical solution that tries to inhibit bacterial growth and promote the enamel to remineralize. And so from a layperson's perspective, you might think this is something that might be more approachable because it can be done by a dental hygienist, or it could just be done by a school nurse at the school. And so they compared these two. The primary outcome was caries control failure. And at the end of the day, it was very interesting. They actually showed that the silver diamine fluoride patients did better. They had a lower failure rate. And so you can imagine from an implementation angle, from a policy angle even, how impactful a study like this could be, because we're talking about low resource community settings where kids generally have to go to school, and there may be a means of reaching more of these kids to give them good dental care than referring these kids to a dental clinic. So lots of things to think about that sort of look at the impact of this particular PCORI funded study. Here's the other one that I alluded to earlier on. This is a study that looked at 1,500 patients with acute appendicitis at 25 hospitals across the US. And, I didn't, this study predated my tenure here at PCORI, but I would have been surprised to see that this is a study that's doable. I didn't know that there would be equipoise to randomize to acute appendectomy versus a delayed assessment for the need for appendectomy, such as an antibiotic course. But interestingly, in this non-inferiority study, they found that at 30 days, antibiotics was non-inferior to appendectomy. And this was with the primary endpoint of patient-reported health status. More importantly, half of the patients who got the antibiotics weren't even admitted to the hospital. They were able to go home. And within the next 3 months, only 29% of those underwent appendectomy. I think we were all kind of surprised by these results. This was a very impactful study. The American College of Surgery immediately incorporated these results into their national guidelines. The investigators also got an dissemination implementation study award to try to make the results of the study more open in terms of online shared decision-making tools and to help patients be able to select treatment. So a very impactful study was also published, of course, in a very high impact journal. I'm going to skip the next one, talk about the next one here, which is looking at patients with implantable cardiac devices like pacemakers and defibrillators. This is a study that's going on right now. This is one of our Placer Awards. So this is one of those large randomized clinical trials. It's going to ultimately involve 3,000 patients. Right now, if someone gets a pacemaker, they generally have to come in to see one of our electrophysiologists at least once or twice a year. And then every 90 days or so, they have to upload information remotely from their device so that we can check their device to make sure that they didn't have any adverse events or anything we needed to be concerned about. That's the guidelines standard pathway. This study is interesting in that it's saying, hey, do we need all of that? And it's going for a pathway that is really mostly alert driven or patient driven. So if the patient doesn't feel right, or if the device detects something that's going on, only then would it trigger a visit. But other than that, it would not trigger a standard visit. And you can see that their outcomes include both an effectiveness outcome because it's trying to prove that by doing so, you're actually making life easier for the patients, but also a safety outcome. At the end of the day, these are pieces of metal machinery that are implanted into humans, and you want to make sure that they are safe. Now, this study, I'm sure, was not easy to put together, but one of the things I really wanted to highlight for you is how well the study team has partnered with the stakeholders in their community, including the FDA, including the electrophysiologists, including the makers of these devices, including the health insurers, to make sure, alongside patients and caregivers, that they're designing the study correctly to actually be able to make an impact at the end of the day. And they won't come up with a situation at the end of the day where they get a study result and one of these stakeholders is going to say, well, you didn't think about X, Y, and Z. So that's why we're going to ignore the results of your study. So that upfront engagement, not just with the patients, but with the entire community is one of the things that I think is so special about PCORI funded awards. And this one is a really good example of that. Okay. All right, switch gears a little bit. People often ask, do you have anything for early stage investigators? And I would say, quite frankly, the answer is no. We don't have a mechanism where if you're an early stage investigator, you get a leg up. You get a lower pay line or whatever it is. But we do have in our BPS, that broad pragmatic study funding opportunity, an opportunity for senior mentors to mentor early and mid-career investigators to give them even a sub-study that they might lead as part of this. So they wouldn't be PI of the study, but they could be a co-I of the study with dedicated funds to support structured mentorship of these individuals. So for those of you who either mentor folks or want to be mentored by folks, it's important for you to take a look at the Broad Pragmatic Studies funding opportunity. Now I'm going to end with a few other types of funding opportunities PCORI offers. So far I've been spending a good chunk of time talking about the CER awards. So I'm also going to talk about some of our D&I and engagement awards. Let's talk about engagement awards first. So I told you that we would like our research to partner with patients. And we know that that is not easy to do. For example, how do you even find patients to partner with? How do you find patient-centered organizations to work with? How do you make sure that those folks and you guys as researchers are on the same page with regards to a research award? And so we do have some monetary support to help get communities convened to explore CER possibilities. Or if there's a community organization that's very interested in partnering, but doesn't yet quite have the capacity to work with you as a full partner in a CER award, there is funding up to $300,000 and 2 years to be able to help those communities increase their ability to participate with you in CER. So you could think of some of these as basically funding the prep work before you go ahead and apply for a CER award. So I do want you to be thinking about some of these. You don't necessarily have to do it completely on your own dime or on your own free time. On the back end of the project, when a CER result is out, we want to make sure that that result goes into practice as quickly as possible. And so we have a lot of dissemination and implementation program funding opportunities. Some of these are limited competitions in that they're open to the study team of the CER project to take their project to the next step in terms of implementation. But some of these we think are such amazing results that everyone should have the chance to try to implement these results. And so you'll see on the right-hand side, we sometimes have monies up to 1.8 million in direct cost to support other places being able to implement the results of CER funded by PCORI. So as an example of that, we had funded a study several years ago looking at cancer patients and piloting 2 different ways of following symptoms over time. One is through routine clinic-based types of visits, and one is through an electronic PRO tool that was embedded into the electronic medical record to help with weekly symptom monitoring and management. And at the end of the day, not only did the folks who have the electronic symptom monitoring do better in terms of feeling better, in terms of reducing the need to go to the ER, for example, we felt that this was something that really needed to get spread out a lot more. And so a bunch of folks got together to be able to put together a couple of implementation awards that now allows this study result to penetrate 9 large health systems in multiple states that you can see on the right-hand side. So the reach is going to be up to 230 patient care clinics, as well as 70,000 patients. And there's involvement from a couple of different EMR vendors as well to try to embed this into routine clinical care as well. So that kind of gives you an example of what we mean when we say, let's take something that was a very meaningful CER result and make sure that it gets translated into practice. All right, this is where I am going to end. I think we have about 15 minutes left for questions, which was exactly where I wanted to be. I'm sure I didn't cover everything. That website on the screen here gives you some more, points you again to that funding announcement page. And if you have any questions about your potential project that you'd like to talk to a program officer about, that email address at the bottom, PFA, PCORI funding announcements at pcori.org, is a great way to get triage to someone who has expertise in your area. All right. Dr. Kierbeck, I'm going to turn this back over to you to see if there's any questions.
Well, I am grateful on behalf of everyone, such an informative and clear um, presentation. I wanted to thank Picori for supporting our palliative care work, because this kind of investment is so needed for patients and community. I guess I'm going to start us off with a question building on that. How do you see comparative clinical effectiveness research evolving to better include older adults with multimorbidity and functional decline? These, are often excluded from clinical trials, yet they represent the core population of people living with serious illness?
Great question. We've actually had a pretty remarkable portfolio of those involving older adults or those with multiple chronic comorbidities. Certainly a good number of these studies do traditional recruitment, for example, through clinics, to be able to reach these patients. I also love that the endpoints that are studied in these studies are endpoints that are really relevant to this population. It's not necessarily about length of life. It's a lot of it is about quality of life or other patient-centered metrics that are important. I'll also say I've been really fascinated to see that it doesn't also stop at that population in terms of the patients. Many of our studies have involved caregivers of that population. So this could include family and friends, but it could also include some of the clinical and non-clinical workers that are assisting this population. So, for example, we had a number of pandemic era studies that looked at vaccination of long-term care workers to try to minimize the spread of COVID to the patients that they're receiving care for. And you know that many of that workforce is actually non-clinical. They're not necessarily physician or clinician or nurse trained in any way, shape, or form, but they are also a very diverse, often under-resourced population as well. So I think we've had a chance to touch many of those adjacent areas to that as well. Recently, we funded a couple of really, I think, lovely studies that have focused on Alzheimer's and related dementia, which is an issue that is quite critical, I would say, in the older adult population, not only in terms of cognitive disability, but also functional impairment as well. And then one thing I'll finally say is that more recently we've had our board approve one of the topic themes that we're going to focus on the next 3 years, which is about promoting health and preventing disease. And so this is really taking a much more holistic, it's not so much of a drug A versus drug B type of comparator that we're interested in. It is really more along the lines of how do you think about delivering whole person health, whether it's related to nutrition, whether it's related to physical activity, whether it's related to the use of even complementary or alternative clinical supports. And I can imagine that the older adult population would probably be a major beneficiary of that topic theme as well.
Thank you. So looking, we have questions.
Yeah, I see one. So the question is, what is widespread use? Is evidence that a practice is done at multiple hospitals and academic centers enough? Yes and no. You're going to have some patient level evidence. So there was one time we got an application that says, hey, me and 5 of my other buddy doctors use this approach, and that's probably not enough. What you might need is to say, this approach using maybe administrative claims data or something like that is shown to be used in about 40% of the population, whereas this other approach is being used in about 30% of the population with this particular diagnosis. That's probably the right amount of evidence to characterize widespread use. And hopefully it transcends just your geographic area. Maybe there's representation for at least 2 to 3 of the major sort of geographic areas across the US. So hopefully that helps you with widespread use. Is preference given to multi-institutional studies in the spirit of demonstrating results generalizability? Depends on what you mean by multi-institutional studies. We do have studies that have dual PIs and dual institutions, but not every study, I mean, if the coordinating study doesn't have to be split between several institutions. But in terms of sites, we are highly unlikely to fund, for example, I used to be at Duke. If it's a study that's being done only at Duke, and Duke is a pretty large site because obviously encompasses a good chunk of North Carolina and a few other neighboring states as well. But it's really just localized to that area. That would probably be lower priority for funding. Now, there are decentralized trials where there's only one coordinating center, but you're recruiting patients from all over the US. That is not a multi-institutional study, but it's certainly demonstrating generalizability. You also have large health systems. I'm going to put Kaiser, for example, out there as an example where generally, a Kaiser will cover a pretty large swath of different geographic areas, but my suggestion is that if you're able to cover, so if you divide the US into Northeast, Midwest, South, and West Coast, if you're able to at least cover 2 of those large geographic areas, you're on much firmer ground than if you cover just one of those areas. Okay? Do you have tips or resources on how to create a successful letter of intent? You need to answer all of the things that I just talked about in my slides, basically. Take a look at that PCOT slide, the one that says, and I'm happy to share my slides after the discussion. I'll send it over to Dr. Kierbeck's team so that it can be shared with everyone. But you need to speak to all the elements on that PCOT slide in order for this to be successful. If you're missing something, you're not going to be successful. For example, if you just say, I am going to be patient-centered in choosing this particular outcome, that's probably not going to be enough. You're going to have to say something along the lines of, we have already had conversations with payers and patients, and among these options, we picked this particular as our primary outcome. That is probably more likely to demonstrate patient-centeredness than just saying, I think this is patient-centered. All right, I got 3 there. Any others?
Looks like all we got for now. Will you be sharing your slides?
I will.
Okay.
I'll send it to you.
Thank you so much, Dr. Wong. We really appreciate it.
Thank you, Dr. Wong, and safe travel home.